Welcome back to the shop, everyone. In this week's video, we've got a 3-week in one. We have week 23, June 6th to June 12th, week 26, June 27th to July 3rd, and week 27, July 4th to July 10th. Now, the reason why I've done a 3-in-1, because I'm so behind, and the week 23 and week 27 were so short, I decided it would be best just to combine all three into one video. It's going to help me catch up and also make this a little bit longer for you. Alright, so what are we doing in this video? Well, in this video, you can see that I have some wiring there that I'm unspooling. This is brand new wiring that I just got in order to continue my wiring on the build. This was a very tedious process. When Pico, the company who I got the wire through, wrapped these, they put all the saran wrap really tight to the top and it kind of got stuck in there. So as you can see, I got my knife out and I'm just kind of pulling it out, and then I gotta mess with it a little bit, get a little bit of it out, and then I can actually unravel the entire roll. So one of the things about me is I like to do things to the best of my abilities, and I don't like cheaping out just for no reason. When I build my next car, I'll be able to reuse a lot of this wiring, so I wasn't too worried about spending a little bit on wire and having extra. And another thing I didn't want is for every wire in the car to be red. It's a little bit easier to troubleshoot if your wire is color coded. I mean, if you label everything correctly, having everything as a red wire there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not what I wanted. So what I'm doing now, since I need to run a pile of wires from the back of the car where the fuse box and the Dominator is up to the front of the car, I'm just trying to build this crappy little wire holder. It didn't work. Sticking that ready rod through the box, it just fell over. There's just too much weight. So I'm trying to figure out a whole way that I can get this so I can, pull 4 spools of wire at the same time. As I'm, sitting there pondering, I came up with an idea. So I've just gone over to the toolbox right now and I grabbed some mechanics wire. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take some mechanics wire, wrap it around the cupboard handles, and then wrap it around to the end of that ready rod. For my purposes right now, this is as good a solution as any. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the color of wire and doing my best to match it to the wires that it's going to go with. So right now I'm running power wires for my coils, and so each of those coil wires, they have their own specific color coming out of the Dominator, so I'm doing my best to match it up to that. So I'm just pulling the wires through the car, getting them roughly to length. I'm going to run them down the tunnel. I'll run them up right around where I want them, and then I'll pull them across the bar to where they need to go. My plan is I'm going to have 4 coils run on either side of the car, so 4 on the driver's side, 4 on the passenger side, and they're going to be on the front frame rails. So that's why I've got 4 of these wires bundled together right now and running to one side, is because those are going to be the wires for the, I think this is the passenger side I'm doing right now probably. And now that I have my rough length, when I grab the next 4 wires, I can just, you know, cut them to the same length as this, and that should be good. Actually, looks like I was adding some electrical tape to each wire just so I could label it, so that way when I go to terminate later, I know exactly which wire is which. And as I mentioned, I tried to get the wires as close to what their trigger wires are, and one of the trigger wires is light green, one is green, one is light blue, one is blue. So I use green twice and blue twice, so it's really important to label your stuff. Since it looks like I'm done with the orange, the gray, and the, might be pink, might be red. It's probably pink. Since I'm done with those wires, I just tape them up so that when I unroll the next set, those spools don't unravel as well. So I'm just adding those 2 new wires to the existing bundle, and if I recall correctly, the greens and the blues go to the same side, so I'm going to cut this and then I'm going to grab green and blue a second time and just do the same thing. Oh, no. So I do have 8 wires there. So for on the first run, I had all 6 wires. And then on that second run, I just grabbed the 2 more for my last 2. So I have 8 wires total, 8 coils. So what I'm doing here is I'm just looking at my connector diagram. I'm just going through some stuff. Alright, so as you just saw, I just pulled that entire bundle back out and I said, no. So what happened is I reread the wiring diagram. I reread the Holley directions for the big wire kit. And you only need a single power wire per coil pack. So I only need 1 power wire for the passenger coils, and I need 1 for the driver side coils. So that's why I just pulled that bundle right back out, because I don't need it. That's part of the joys about this being my first time building a car in general, and more specifically with the Holley system, with the individual coil per cylinder setup. There's a lot of things that I'm doing that I'm going to undo and redo because either I found a better way to do it or I found I don't need it. And that's just part of the process, and you guys get to witness the entire process. You know, I'm not perfect and I do screw up sometimes. And actually, you can see in the background, off camera, between the last video where I was running the wires and this one, I built that little wire rack holder in the back. There's some issues with it, but it serves its purpose. And as you can see, it's much easier now. I can just grab a wire off the spool, off of the reel, spool it out, and yeah, I don't have to, you know, hook up a wire to my cupboards every time I want to switch reels. If I had to do it again, would I do it differently? Absolutely. But for now, it's good enough, and I'm not going to redo it. So what I'm doing now is I'm redoing my coil power as orange, and the reason why I'm doing that is because it's going to be a single power wire to each bank, so I don't need to color code it, and orange has pretty much been the color I've done for anything that's on ignition circuit. The reason why I've done that is the Ron Francis fuse panel has orange coming back from the steering column as ignition, so I figured I might as well keep that throughout the rest of the car. At the end of the day, the wire doesn't know what color it is, so you could, if you wanted to, wire the entire car with every single wire being a single color, and it'll work fine. Might be a little difficult to troubleshoot if you don't label it properly. Alright, so that is one of the Deutsch HD30 connectors that I got from Maven Speed, and what I'm doing right now is I'm getting ready to put the hole through the firewall for that connector. That connector is going to end up, half it's going to be on the inside of the car in the cabin, and then obviously the other half is in here in the wheel well. So this is where all of the wiring for my coils, my starter solenoid, and a few other things are going to come through. So you just saw I'm just figuring out the best hole saw for this. I've already marked the circle that I need to cut out, but as you can see, there's already a hole in the firewall. And these hole saws, you really need to have a drill bit go straight through the center of the hole. And I don't really have that here because of that existing hole. So I do something kind of dumb, and I just make it work. You know, if I was smart, what I would have done is welded up that hole, or at least put a piece of metal on the back to drill through to have my pilot hole. Because what happens is, because the center of the connector is so close to the existing hole, when I punch through with the center drill bit, the hole saw just wants to walk all over the place. And you can kind of see that here. You can see at the bottom there, that should be a nice consistent ring, but it's, you know, what, a ½ inch deep. That means that the drill bit started to bite in and then it walked its way up. What I'm doing is I'm just trying to figure out what's the best way to get this hole done. So you can see I just grabbed this sheet of metal and I'm like, you know, can I weld this on the back? Can I weld up the hole? What do I do? And then I just decided, screw it, I'm just gonna strong arm this. I'm gonna make it work. And that's what I do, and I end up getting the hole exactly as I needed it. It was kind of nasty, not the best thing in the world, but I got the end result I needed. What I'm doing here is I'm taking my carbide bit on my die grinder, and I'm just going to deburr the hole a bit to make it a little bit cleaner. So now that we have the hole all deburred and cleaned up, we can start marking out the mounting holes. So you can see with the Sharpie, I'm just marking out the 4 holes, and then I'm going to drill them out, and then we can get this piece mounted on. Alright, so if I were smart or had any friends, I would be able to have somebody help me out with this, but since I don't have any friends, I'm just using that magnet just to hold the bolt in place, and I'm using a second magnet just to hold the whole setup on the car so that I can go from the back side and install a nut on that first bolt. And then at some point I realized I can just reach around from the inside of the car to the outside of the car and hold the bolt while I'm doing up the nut on the back side. Don't need friends after all. This is proof. Now that we have the through panel connector in place for the coil wiring, what I did is I just grabbed the Maven Speed coil mounting brackets and I'm putting them together. I'm going to put 4 coils on this side, get it all set up, put it on the front end, and just kind of get it placed and figure out where we're going to put it. So I'm recording this video in mid-November, and even currently the plan is that we are going to leave the coils up in this area of the car. I don't see any reason why I would move it at this point, but maybe somewhere down the line it doesn't work and I want it somewhere else. But right now, this is where it's going. And I gotta say, I love this entire setup. The bracket is just so nice, the fit is nice, the finish is nice, it's just a beautiful piece. If you want to do something like this, I would highly recommend them. Jared over there is fantastic to deal with. I ran into an issue with something later on, and just great to deal with. Highly recommended. Alright, so what I'm doing now is I'm getting my coil wiring, and I am just plugging it into all the coils and just trying to figure out where the wiring is going to go, where I'm going to, you know, route that connector. And as you can see right now, with how these coils are so close together, there's a lot of excess wire that I don't really like, so I'm gonna have to figure out what to do with that. You know, on the rest of the car, everything is just kind of cut to length and very clean and organized, and this is, well, it's a mess. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, this is probably set up and built for a specific car, or maybe Holly just added a bunch of length to it, but at the end of the day, I don't really care for it, so I will have to figure something out for it. Alright, so now we have the first fender connector done, we can start planning for the engine bay connector. So the connector in the fender well is a 29 pin connector, and the one in the engine bay is a 47 pin connector. In order to make sure I'm not going to have anything in the way, I grabbed my fuel rail for this intake so that I can make sure that, that connector isn't going to hit, because if I drill the hole and then it hits the fuel rail, that's a big problem. So grab it out, grab a couple screws, mount it to the intake, and that tells me how much clearance I have and where I can mount that connector on the firewall. So what I just grabbed is I grabbed down my fuel fitting box and fuel line box, and I'm attaching a couple of the fittings to the back of the fuel rail. Again, this is just to make sure that I have clearance between the things that are going on the fuel rail and that connector. It's all about, building this car is all about figuring it out kind of as I go and making sure that certain things don't interfere with, you know, other things. Like here I am, I'm briefly considering moving this connector over more to the passenger side, but in the end I realized, you know, I got a heater box in the back, so running all the wires behind the heater box be a bit of a pain in the ass. Don't really want to do that. So I'm back over in my originally planned location. I shouldn't have any interference there. The throttle cable comes out below, the clutch is over to the right, so having it in that area should be pretty safe, I believe. So I have finally made the decision. It's going right by the fuel rail. So you already saw this process once, so here it goes again. Mark the hole, drill the hole, mark the mounting holes, drill the mounting holes, and then get the connector installed. So finally, with the intake just loosely back on the engine, I can check and make sure that I do have clearance to pull that connector off if I need to. And I do. I got more than enough room. This is going to work perfectly. And so now I'm going to procrastinate a bit and just figure out next steps. So I'm just grabbing my fuel pressure regulator, and I'm trying to think of where the best place to mount this is. I want the fuel lines kind of hidden. I want it so when you open the hood, everything's nice, it's clean, it's tidy. And so that's kind of why I want the fuel pressure regulator on the back side of the engine plate, is it would be kind of hidden. And every once in a while we get a visit from our neighborhood kitty Bootsy. She's a little bit unfriendly today. Usually she'll let me scratch her belly, but you win some, you lose some. Okay, so that big stack of boxes in the back corner there, that's all of my rims for the car. So what I am doing is I'm just grabbing out one of the rims and I'm going to mount it onto the rotor, and I'm going to check clearances. I want to see exactly where this wheel is going to sit, and I can kind of visualize where tires going to go. Obviously I don't have tires for it yet, but this will give me an idea, and this will give me a rough guess as to whether or not the coils can actually sit where they are. I think the coils will be fine where they are, but I don't like the fuel line being where it is. I don't like the fuel line being run in the fender. If something happens, I get into a front end collision, somebody clips me on the driver's side, a tire blows up, you know, and it cuts that fuel line, even though it is a steel braided line, it's not a good place to have fuel puking out of your car. I feel it would be better having the fuel lines run inside the frame rails. That way, especially in this car, you know, I got the cage, I got the through floor subframe connectors. If I run it more or less with the frame rails, I'm safer in the event of an accident. You know, if something happens, you know, somebody hits me hard enough and I get knocked out, and you know, there's fuel spilling everywhere because I wasn't able to turn the ignition off and kill the fuel pump. You know, it's just not a good scenario. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to see where I can run this fuel line and where I'm happy with it. And as you can kind of see, I've got it running up the engine plate and then under the intake and between where the distributor and the intake is going to go. And that's, you know, so I can kind of run it to the back of the engine up to the two fuel rails, and then the front of the fuel rails will go down to the fuel pressure regulator. But I don't even know if that's gonna work. So what I did is I grabbed my distributor and I'm just gonna loosely see if I have enough clearance to even get that fuel line in that position. And at the end of the day, I really don't. So that fuel line can't go there. The only thing that can run in that space is the distributor, and that's fine. So as you can see on the top of the distributor, there's a bunch of little points, and typically each one of those points would go to one cylinder and the one in the middle would go to a coil. As I mentioned before, I'm running those 4 individual coils on the passenger side, which you've seen me install, and then I'm going to have 4 on the driver's side. So I no longer need the top part of the distributor. I'm only going to be using this distributor as a crank sensor and a cam sensor for the Holley Dominator ECU. So what I just did is I removed the cap, I removed the rotor, which would typically spin around and trigger each of the spark plugs, and just put the blanking cap that I got when I bought the distributor. What I'm doing here is, that was my alternator mounting bracket, and I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to mount stuff to this engine. Obviously I have the engine plate, and that is going to cause a lot of fitment issues. Most of these things aren't expecting an engine plate. You just, install your accessory, install your brackets, and away you go. Now I'm just taking the wheel off. I'm going to put it back in its box, put it back in the pile, so that way it's all nice and safe. I've done what I needed to do with it. I've checked all the fitment and I'm happy with it. Man, I love those wheels so much. Although I don't like the fact that there's chromes on the outside, so I might have to plasti dip that or something else. I'm not 100% sure yet, but I absolutely love the style of those wheels. I'm so glad I got them. Okay, so after my bit of testing, I found that I don't like where the fuel lines are. As I mentioned to you before, I don't like the idea of having them in the wheel well. It could possibly cause an issue if I'm ever in a front-end collision. So I'm going to reroute the fuel lines, and they're going to go on the inside of the fuel rail and up behind the mid plates. And then I'll do all of my fuel connections from the back of the engine bay instead of trying to run it up the up the frame rail on the inside of the fender here. So that's what I'm doing right now, just rerunning these fuel lines to behind the mid plate and up into the engine bay. So there you can see fuel lines are now behind the mid plates, and those will just come nicely up the firewall, and I'll have the fuel pressure regulator on the firewall, and I will have the fuel lines feed either the back of the fuel rail or the front of the fuel rail somehow, and then So after a bunch of pondering, I'm back to trying to envision how I'm going to get this alternator bracket installed. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roughly put the distributor back in. Part of this is going to be trying to figure out where I'm going to run the wiring, you know, stuff like that. Now that I have the distributor back in, I'm just back to trying to figure out what my next steps are and where to go. Oh, now that we've got some of the front end work done and coils installed, we're gonna get back to wiring the back of the car. So I'm grabbing some wire here. I think this is a blue wire. This is probably gonna be wiring for the water pump, I think. Yeah, so it looks like what I got there is two blue 14 gauge wires, and that's going to be for my water pump. The water pump, I actually want a 12 gauge wire, but there's no 12 gauge connector on the 47 pin connector that I'm using on the firewall. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run two 14s from the relay in the back into the connector. And then from the connector, I'm going to run the two 14s to the front. I'll join them to a 12 gauge, and that'll go to the water pump. what to do is I'm just going to start running some little wire saddles that the zip ties can go to, and I'm going to start getting the routing of this wiring on the passenger side done. So I've got some self-tapping screws, I've got some, I call them wire saddles, and as much as I like these, I'm having a tough time getting them right now. So what I might do is switch to a weld-on style tab. I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna do yet, but for right now and for mock-up, this is more than good enough, because I can just cut the zip ties as much as I need and, you know, keep running wires, keep bundling them up, and just cut zip ties, add zip ties, no big deal. This is really nice for mocking up at the very least. Yeah, I'm actually using a tape measure to get the existing spacing between the mounts. I kind of like having everything spaced out the same, very symmetrical. It's what my eye goes to when I see something that's not lined up straight. My eye goes right to it, and I'm like, why didn't they just, you know, make that the same or line that up straight? So that's what I'm doing. So I actually designed and 3D printed some wire holders that will fit the radius of my dash bar. So I'm just cleaning it up. When I 3D printed it, there's a kind of a backing to it that I'm just sanding off of it. I didn't do a great job because these are plastic, so when I got it on the sander, it just kind of melted the plastic more than actually removing it, which was kind of ugly, but it works enough for now, and I might see if there's a different solution. But I actually kind of really like these, so for now I'm going to put them in the car. I might leave them on there permanently, I haven't decided yet. But you can see here in a second when I put this on, it'll fit right over the radius of the dash bar. I designed it so that you can use a zip tie to hold it to the dash bar, and then the top part will have another zip tie to hold the wire bundle to the mount. So I think it's kind of slick, but again, I'm not sure if I'm going to keep them. We'll see. What I'm doing is I'm just routing the wires up across the trans tunnel and up towards the firewall connector there, and I'm just adding some white electrical tape just to keep the wires bundled, and that'll kind of tell me where I need to cut this bundle of wires. What I'm doing is I'm pulling out the coil wires from that bundle. Because my coils are going to sit on the fenders on both sides of the car, I need the wires going to them to not be in the main bundle that goes up to that 47 pin connector. So I'm just pulling all those coil wires back, I'm pulling them out of the bundle, so that way when I go to cut this main bundle here, I don't cut the wires that have to run along the dash bar to the outside of the car. What I'm doing here is I'm removing some of the electrical tape from the wires that I bundled earlier. When I initially wrapped them all up, I did them, longer than I needed, and so I'm just undoing some of that back to where I'm gonna cut it. wire a little bit lower under where I'm going to cut it, so that way I have wire labels at the end after it's cut, and then on the lower side for when I wire it into the bulkhead connector. swap out. I'm reading the wiring diagram. Obviously one of these wires, I'm like, what does it do? Where does it go? Do I need it? And so I'm reading the wire diagrams, and then I eventually hit YouTube and watch a YouTube video to try and figure out exactly what it is. I don't remember what the wire was or what I was looking at, but this is part of the process, is reading the wiring diagrams and just going through it time and time again. Because again, this is my first car. If I were to rewire a second car with a Dominator, it would be so much easier. I'd be able to do it so much quicker. But you live and you learn. time. We're doing it. Cut the bundle. That's so stressful because that's, you know, potentially a $400 mistake. That unterminated harness from Holley, I think, is in the ballpark of like 420 bucks or something like that. So that's one of the reasons why I procrastinate so long on some of this stuff, is because if I mess up, it's potentially expensive to fix. But as you can see, the rest of the wires are going to, you know, go from that connector under the intake, and they're all labeled on the front. They're all labeled on this side, so we are good to go. well, since we're cutting harnesses and living in the danger zone, we should start terminating these wires. So this right here is one of the ignition switch wires, and I didn't want any splices in this harness. So that's a brand new ignition switch connector, and with that connector came like 4 or 5 inch short wires that are pre-terminated that you would butt splice onto, and you know, that's the way it would connect. I didn't want that. I wanted the wire to start the fuse box and end at the switch. So I actually went out and bought those Ford box terminals, specifically so I could terminate directly into the new switch and not have to use those little pigtails and splice. So what I'm doing is I'm stripping the wire back a little bit, and then I'm just crimping the box ends onto the wire and putting it into the ignition switch connector where it goes. So there's battery power into the switch. Then we're gonna have an accessory feed out. So when you turn the key back, it's gonna send power to very specific accessory circuits. We have an ignition circuit. So when you turn the key forward once, that's your ignition. So that's gonna be stuff like your, you know, distributor, coils, your ECU, anything required to run the car. And then we have a hot wire crank wire, and that's very critical on these cars. And the reason being, stuff like your coils and your fuel pump and your ECM, ECM or ECU, engine control unit or engine control module, all acronyms for, you know, the Holley Dominator is my ECU. That needs power while the engine is cranking. If you don't have power to those things when your engine's trying to crank, it's not going to get fuel, it's not going to get spark, none of the sensors are going to be working. So you have to make sure that you connect the hot with crank wire out of the ignition switch back to whatever is feeding the power for your ECU and your coils and all that other stuff. And then I run a second ignition wire way later in a different video, but that's another wire that goes into the switch. So one ignition wire is going to feed my fuse box. So what happens is when you turn the key to ignition, it's going to power up all of the ignition circuits on the fuse box. And then the second ignition wire will be so that I can power other relays or anything else that needs to run on the ignition when the ignition is on. So what I'm doing here is I've got my ignition key, and I'm going to plug in the old connector because it's already got a bunch of pigtails on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just testing each circuit and making sure it is exactly what I think it is. So I've got one of those leads on the battery, which would feed into the switch, and I'm just checking to make sure that, you know, when the wire says it's ignition, that when the key is in ignition, that it is in fact the ignition wire. When it's on all the way forward, which is your crank position, that it is, you know, the crank wire that I expect it to be. I'm just double checking these things so that way, you know, when I go to actually start the car, you know, something silly doesn't happen, like I turn the ignition and the starter fires. You don't want stuff like that, so just double checking, making sure that what you've got on the wiring diagram matches what is in reality is always a good thing. starting to tidy up the wires a little bit. So since we're already in the terminal terminating mood, let's move on to one of the multifunction switches. So on the steering column, there are 3 connectors that come into it, I believe. One of the connectors is for the wipers, and then the other 2 connectors do stuff like your turn signals, your high beam, your low beam, and what else would be on there? That might be it. So yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start wiring in the turn signals, the high beam, and yeah, I think that's it. And what I'm doing is when the right turn signal goes, there is a wire that is going to feed out to the front right turn signal, and the back right turn signal, and one to feed the turn indicator light. So both of those wires go into the same terminal on this connector, and you can kind of see on the brand new connector on the left, again, these connectors come with short little pigtails that you're supposed to just, you know, crimp onto, like butt splice onto, but I don't want to do that. Luckily, these terminals also use those same Ford box terminals that I got for the ignition switch. But you can see like the orange wire, there's 2 coming out of the same terminal, and that's because that is, you know, like turn signal, for example. One of those wires would go to your turn signal light on the dash, and one goes out to your front and right turn signals. Right now, I'm reading the wiring diagram, and again, just going over everything I've already labeled on the old connector, just to make sure I have the understanding in my mind what these do, where they go, and how I'm gonna wire this. So I'm grabbing some yellow wire, and what I'm doing right now is wiring what they call the passing switch. So on a lot of vehicles, and maybe not necessarily all, if your high beams are on your, if to turn on your high beams, it's on the left stick. Usually you push it forward to turn the high beams on. But if you just pull back, it'll briefly turn them on, and it's called a passing switch. So if you're going out to pass somebody, you know, you flash the high beams, and then you go out and you pass them type of thing. So that's what this yellow wire is for. It's going to connect into the multifunction switch on the steering column. So when you pull back on the left stalk, it turns the high beams on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start organizing the wires on the driver's side here a bit. I'm going to get some mounts, drill them in, and just start getting them run to the back of the car. Now that I have the ignition terminated, I can kind of start doing this. Before the ignition was terminated, I didn't know how long the wires were going to be. You know, it's starting to look so clean. I'm pretty happy with this, but I know that there's still so much more to do. cleaned up a little bit, let's actually start wiring the multifunction switches. So that big bundle of wire that I'm playing with there is most of the wiring that's supposed to wire into that little infotainment screen at the top of the center console there. So you can kind of see the outline of a car. At the top right there it says washer fluid, bottom left it says, what does that say? Maybe tail light or something like that. So that wiring goes from, the idea is that you have a wire feed out of your light switch into one side of a circuit, and then you have a resistance wire that connects from that connection into another wire, and then it feeds out to the bulb. So what happens is in that display circuit, it knows that there's supposed to be a certain amount of resistance across the 2 points, and if the light bulb is out, then the resistance changes and the light comes on. And so I'm going through this wiring, just looking at it and trying to figure out the best way to go about wiring this in. After humming and hawing and just kind of realizing how much wiring this is actually going to add, I've decided to just scrap that little info center, other than maybe the low fuel and maybe the low washer fluid. But at the end of the day, I don't really care if the headlight's out or brake light's out and it doesn't light up there. Another thing is, if I switch over to LED lights, that will not be compatible because the resistance of LEDs is so much less than conventional light bulbs that it just doesn't work. That's it for the multi-function switch wiring. It's done. I'm connecting it into the steering column. Life is good. multifunction connectors that go onto the steering column, so let's do the same thing for the second one. We'll get it wired. As with most things in life, the second time around goes so much quicker, and you know, getting that second switch done, I was just banged it out super quick because, you know, I wasn't as apprehensive about it. I'd already done the first one, so yeah, we just got her done, got it connected, and we're going to clean up some of the wiring now. You know what time it is? It's cleanup time. Now that we've got a bunch of this stuff done, let's get all the stuff out of the car. Let's get our workspace organized a little bit. Let's make our lives a little bit more friendly while working. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a wiper motor connector that goes onto the steering column. I was not able to find that connector anywhere. And after looking through some wiring diagrams later and doing some research, there's also a module that goes to the wipers to work the intermittent wiper, so when you have it on delay. And I wasn't able to find the connector that goes into the steering column or the box in any of this wiring harness or any of my electrical boxes or connectors. So I don't know if a long time ago when I started pulling the harness and steering column out, if I just like turfed it or I got rid of it. Like here's the actual wiper motor and there's the wiring, but I'm missing the from the switch to the connector on there. So yeah, it's just real weird that I don't have it, and kind of frustrating too. So I'm grabbing my dashboard, I'm grabbing my gauge cluster, and I want to start figuring out how I'm going to wire all of those gauges together. Each one of those gauges has a power, a ground, and an illumination wire. So when you turn your your park lights on, all of your dash lights are supposed to come on. So I've got, what is it, something like 8, 9, 10 gauges on that cluster now, I believe. So I need to figure out a nice clean way of getting power, ground, and the illumination wire to all of those gauges. And my initial thought is I'm going to build a plate that will sit at the very bottom of the dash, and on that plate is where I will mount some wire connectors, or I should say some bus bars. So I'll have the power feed into it, the ground feed onto it, and the illumination wire feed onto it, and then it'll split from there. But what I need to make sure is that I have enough clearance between that back plate and the gauge cluster. You know, the last thing I want is, as I'm driving down the road, and that aluminum gauge cluster, you know, if it moves around at all, I don't want it shorting out on the back side. Another thing I have to put in there is there's a little module that I have to connect for all of the gauges, and that module connects back to the Dominator, and then each gauge just daisy chains into itself. So this is kind of my initial template and initial thoughts as to how I'm going to wire this stuff. I don't know if I'm going to keep these angled. I don't know if I'm going to try and get them in there straight on, but that's the basic thoughts. So what I'm grabbing down right now is the box that has all the instructions for the gauges, because I want to make sure, you know, I know that there's things like the fuel pressure, or sorry, the fuel level that has its own sender that will need to be run to the back of the car, and I want to make sure I have all the instructions. That right there is a module I was talking about that goes back to the Dominator, and then the other wire will connect into one of the gauges. And what I'm connecting here is all of the wires that go to the gauges. So when I put the gauges into the cluster, I left all of the pigtails just in the box, so I'm grabbing those out now and connecting this stuff. These Holley gauges don't need to run directly to every sender on the car. All of the sensors talk to the Holley, and then the Holley through that module talk to all the gauges. The gauges have wires that just connect from one gauge to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next in a daisy chain, and they all get the information from the same source. What I'm doing is I'm just getting all of the wiring connected, and then I'm just gonna zip tie them and kind of clean it up a little bit and make it and route them on the back of the cluster in kind of a nice way. I think the GoPro died and I didn't really notice it, and I continued working a little bit, but I didn't work too long. So here we are in week 27, continuing on with the gauge clusters for a bit. As the template sits, we're sitting pretty high up in the dash. So what I'm gonna do is cut it down a little bit, narrow it down a bit, and get it so it sits right at the very back, or the very bottom, or back, I guess, depending on how you're looking at it, of the dash. The reason why I want that is, as I mentioned earlier, so that I keep the electrical connectors as far away from the dash as possible, give me a little bit of space in behind there for all the wiring. And what I will do is, once this template is good, if that's what I'm going to do, I'll actually get the backing plate water jet out of probably 1/8 inch aluminum or something like that. Or for this type of plate, there's not a lot of intricate cuts and stuff, so I might just use a die grinder to cut it out myself. We'll see when I get there. All right. Well, it looks like that's it for this week. I hope some of my ramblings were beneficial or educational. And as always, I'd like to thank you for viewing, and we'll see you in the next one.